Okay, so this is my second lecture, and today we're going to be looking at New Sweden and the Dutch conquest of the region, certainly including what would become the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania later on in the 17th century. So, for New Sweden then, it was a fairly or relatively short-lived colonial venture. It was established in 1638 and only lasted 17 years because it collapsed 17 years later. But the effects and consequences of this enterprise had a surprisingly durable and wide significance. The physical connections between Sweden and its North American colony, though fragile and discontinuous, were sustained right throughout the colonial era, and historians have been able to draw upon personal and indirect experiences of the colony, which were communicated through stories, letters, and travel narratives, and displayed through material collections of curiosa and souvenirs. All of these altered the consciousness or perceptions of America within Old World Sweden. Letters and material objects flowing in the opposite direction, of course, allowed the Swedish-speaking community in America to nurture and construct a sense of identity, origin, and affinity with the old country. The colony, in short, had a distinctive impact on American history that far outweighed its rather small size and brief longevity. But how did that story begin? Okay, before we go into that, I just want to show you a map of New Sweden, and as you can see on the PowerPoint there, if you're listening to the MPEG-3 file, you'll need to look at the PowerPoint file on Blackboard. You could see the territorial extent of the colony of New Sweden stretching into areas of Pennsylvania. If you want to, of course, you can pause the lecture recording and take a closer look at the various maps I've shown you. Okay, so the 17th century saw Sweden emerge as a European great power and one of the major military and political combatants on the continent during the 30 Years' War. By mid-century, the kingdom included part of Norway, all of Finland, and stretched even into Russia. Again, there's a map on the PowerPoint that you might take the opportunity to look at. Sweden's control of portions of modern Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Germany made the Baltic Sea, which again you can see, essentially a Swedish lake. Now, the Swedes were inspired by the riches of other great powers, and the riches indeed that other great powers had gathered from their overseas colonies. So Sweden too sought to extend its influence to the New World, and in 1637 Swedish, Dutch, and German stockholders formed the New Sweden Company to trade for furs and tobacco in North America. Under the command of Peter Minuit, the company's first expedition sailed from Sweden late in 1637 in two ships, the Kalmar Nyckel and Fogel Grip. Apologies for the poor Swedish pronunciation, by the way. And as a note, Minuit was an experienced colonizer. He'd been the governor of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, which was centered on Manhattan Island from 1626 to 1631. Now, these Swedish ships reached the Delaware Bay in March of 1638, and the settlers, the initial settlers, began to build a fort at the site of present-day Wilmington, Delaware. They named it Fort Christina in honor of Sweden's 12-year-old queen. It was the first permanent European settlement in the Delaware Valley. In the spring of 1640, the second Swedish expedition landed with supplies, more soldiers, a chaplain, colonists, goods to be traded with the Indians, and the new governor, Peter Hollander Ridder. And it was Ridder who was pivotal in the colony's expansion. Though the Swedes had more than enough land for its small population, for the small population of New Sweden, Riddler nonetheless insisted on expanding the colony's boundaries. With the aid of some soldiers and a sloop, Riddler sailed north on the Delaware River and defiantly passed the Dutch fort Nassau, which was located in present-day Gloucester City, New Jersey. And well beyond the limits of Fort Nassau, Riddler then met with local Indian chiefs and bought a title to the land, which extended from the Schuylkill tributary to Trenton in New Jersey. So this was a territorial expansion undertaken in defiance of the nearby Dutch, who also had land claims to this area. Now, today, the combined purchases of Minuit and Riddler would comprise 120 miles of land on both banks of the Delaware, from just north of Trenton, New Jersey, as far south as Wilmington, Delaware, including the land that the Dutch Fort Nassau actually sat on, I should say. From 1638 to 1655, 12 more Swedish expeditions left the homeland for New Sweden. A total of 11 vessels and some 600 Swedes and Finns reached their destination. The colony eventually consisted of farms and small settlements along the banks of both the Delaware River and indeed they extended into what would become modern-day New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. New Sweden rose to its greatest heights during the governorship of Johan Prince from 1643 to 1653. And it was Prince who extended settlement northward from Fort Christina along both sides of the Delaware River and improved the colony's military and commercial prospects by building Fort Elfsborg near present-day Salem on the New Jersey side of the river. That would seal the Delaware, essentially, against English and Dutch ships. Despite these steps, the Swedish and Finnish colonists lived peacefully with the Dutch and Lenni Lenape neighbours. The Lenni Lenape, of course, were a local Indian tribe, otherwise known as the Delaware. The Swedes forged particularly close relations with the Susquehanna, and one of the chief sources of our current understanding of that tribe's language is from the vocabulary Mahukasaka, which is a dictionary of sorts compiled by the Swedish missionary Johannes Campanius during the 1640s. Unfortunately, Governor Prince's rule overall was somewhat autocratic, and this left many of the Swedish and Finnish settlers dissatisfied. A petition they launched for reform was actually branded a mutiny, but it was successful in that it led to his return to Sweden. In 1654, Prince was succeeded by the colony's last governor, Johan Rising, at a time when the neighbouring Dutch rival capital of New Amsterdam was ruled by the irascible Peter Stuyvesant. Soon after arriving in New Sweden, Rising attempted to remove the Dutch colony by seizing which is present-day Newcastle, Delaware, which sat below Fort Christina on the western shore of the river. With no gunpowder, Fort Casimir surrendered without a shot and was renamed Fort Trinity. Now, this infuriated Governor Stuyvesant, and his revenge the following summer was soon sorely felt. He sent 7 armed Dutch ships with 317 soldiers to the Delaware River. Now, the Swedes, looking at this, of course, this very large flotilla actually by North American standards at the time, they realized that any resistance would be useless. They were vastly outnumbered, as I say, and they surrendered Fort Trinity, and Governor Rising surrendered Fort Christina 2 weeks later. So with this, Swedish sovereignty over New Sweden was at an end, but the Swedish and Finnish presence was still very much, and would remain in fact, in evidence. It's interestingly, Governor Stuyvesant permitted the colonists to continue as what was called a Swedish nation and be governed by a court of their choosing. They were also free to practice their religion. They were free to organise their own militia, to retain their land holdings, and to continue trading with the native people. This independent Swedish nation continued until 1681, when the Englishman who we'll be studying later on in the module, William Penn, would receive his charter for Pennsylvania, which included the 3 lower counties of present-day Delaware. Now, thinking about the story of Swedish and Finnish emigration to America more widely, while Swedes and Finns continued to settle in New Jersey, Delaware and Pennsylvania, they didn't really begin to arrive in the United States in any significant numbers until the late 19th century. Swedish immigration was actually highest between 1867 and 1914, and that was due, of course, to local conditions which were rather poor economic conditions in Sweden. And America, of course, at this time provided a great deal of available cheap land, especially in the West. And at the peak of immigration in the 1880s, an average of 37,000 Swedes came to the United States each year. Most of the new settlers actually bypassed the original and first colony of New Sweden and headed west, as I say, to Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, California, and Washington. And these are the states which still have the largest numbers of Swedish Americans. But think about these early settlers of New Sweden in our particular period too. And as I've intimated, settlers to New Sweden did come from all over the extensive Swedish realm. And included in this number, of course, were a significant number of Finns. The percentage of Finns in New Sweden grew especially towards the end of their colonization efforts, and they would comprise 22% of the population of New Sweden during Swedish rule. That rose to about 50% after the colony came under Dutch rule. The year 1664 saw the arrival of a contingent of 140 Finns, and in 1655, when the ship Mercurius sailed to the colony, 92 of the 106 passengers were listed as Finns. Memory of the early Finnish settlement lived on in place names near the Delaware River, places such as Finland, in which is Marcus Hook, Torn, Lapland, Finns Point, and Mullica Hill and Mullica River. And again, I apologize if my pronunciation is incorrect with any of these names. Now, a portion of these Finns were known as the Forest Finns, people of Finnish descent living in the forested areas of central Sweden. Now, the Forest Finns had moved from Savonia in eastern Finland to Dalarna, Bergslagen, and other provinces in central Sweden during the late 16th and early to mid 17th centuries. Now, the Finns in Savonia traditionally farmed with a slash and burn method, and that was particularly well suited to pioneering agriculture in vast forested areas, such, of course, as you'd find in North America. This was also the farming method that was used by many of the Native Americans of the region, and was in fact an example of one of those European practices which, however unintentionally, intersected with those of indigenous peoples. So, with this, I hope you get a sense that the settlers in New Sweden and succeeding colonies were continuously forced to navigate lots of cultures. From the start, the colony was a multinational endeavour. Its foundations were raised on the capital, visions and knowledge of Dutch, German and Swedish investors. Its territorial claims encompass land belonging to various groups of Lenape especially, who continue to be involved in the colony's affairs in direct and indirect ways. Its residents included Swedish, Finnish and German-speaking citizens of the Kingdom of Sweden. But there were also, of course, Dutch and English settlers, and indeed Africans, because Sweden was involved in the slave trade and also had colonial outposts in Africa for this very reason. Now, encounters with this diversity of peoples and cultures spurred feelings of curiosity and anxiety. It spurred feelings of reflection, for instance, on similarity and difference. And of course, it required that people interrogate their existing preconceptions. The Northern European ultimately would view Native Americans as the other. And that was a tendency that we would find not just in New Sweden, but also, as I mentioned last week, in the English colonies of North America, including increasingly in Pennsylvania, if not initially. That in turn, I would add, reflected a growing tendency to view all non-Europeans over time through what was called an ethnic gaze. But it wasn't a simple one-way street. Prejudice, misunderstandings and intolerance coexisted with mutual appreciation between Europeans and Native Americans, and I've just mentioned the similarities in the slash and burn farming methods employed by Finns which mirrored native practices. Any hostilities or existing hostilities didn't necessarily preclude friendships and collaborations. Everyday interaction resulted in mutual borrowings and adoption of, for example, foodways, material culture, folklore, and medicinal practices. However, there did always remain between the colonists of New Sweden and Native Americans cultural gaps and differences of opinions, just like with other European peoples. But it wasn't necessarily a one-way street. It was a multifaceted relationship. Now, the connections between Sweden and New Sweden were pronounced during the particular period that the Swedes had a presence in North America. Although this colony was, as I've said, a multicultural endeavour, it was, of course, firmly anchored in the national Swedish interest. It was sponsored for that end largely, and after 1640, it was overseen by the Swedish state. The instructions given to the governors of the colony, for instance, insisted that Swedish laws were replicated, and indeed customs too. The use of the Swedish language was insisted upon, and there was the establishment, of course, of a Lutheran church, all of which were implemented in accordance with instructions. Some of these distinctive traits would survive the colony. The persistence of cultural forms such as language, religion, and certain practices may be directly related to the dynamics of difference that evolved after the English and Dutch takeover, or Dutch and English, I should say more properly, English takeover of the colony. In the second half of the 17th century, the Finnish and Swedish colonists were defined by the Dutch and later the English as a coherent group, the Swedish nation, and soon the colonists came to describe themselves in similar forms. In New Sweden, and after the end of the colony, The transnational ties and determination to stay connected to the old world, to old world Sweden, relied on various technologies. Exchanges of letters and news played an important role in creating a sense of continuous presence in the life of families, for instance, and indeed in communities. And that was despite the physical distance between Old World and New World Sweden. In the context of New Sweden, only a few individuals had the necessary skills and means to correspond with family and friends, and that should also, of course, be borne in mind. Tellingly, the most avid writer was Governor Johan Prins, whose correspondence with Per Brahe and Axel Oxenstierna, besides reporting successes and struggles within the colony, revealed his emotional difficulties in dealing with his dislocation from his homeland. It's interesting that Prince was continuous in his insistence that he regarded Sweden as his only home. Now, replies to the governor's letters containing assurances, instructions, and bits of news were probably read aloud and spread among the colonists too. The few known letters of the freemen written toward the end of the 17th century contain descriptions of conditions in America and calming reassurances of well-being. They were not, however, free from anxieties over irregular contact and worries about their family's situation in Old Sweden, and that's perfectly natural, of course, given the circumstances in which these settlers found themselves. Swedish settlers also sent money and goods back home from the colony to those who had been left behind, and that's again a trait of emigration that isn't unique to this particular region or indeed time. Although, as I've hinted at, relatively few colonists could write, there is a good reason to assume that news delivered in their letters and spread by returnees had a wider reach and contributed to a change in perceptions of America and attitudes towards transatlantic migration. From the horror-inducing popular image of the New World deterring voluntary migration in the 1640s, a decade later, America would emerge as a land of opportunity, attracting more people willing to move, more so than space on ships bound to New Sweden could accommodate. Each ship arriving from or departing for Sweden was regarded with high anxiety and expectation. The vessel carried letters and news, without which the fragile connections between the colony and Sweden would, of course, be weakened. Besides correspondence, ships carried cargoes of goods, which proved to be another essential tool of connectivity. Material objects that the colonists brought and received from Sweden and incorporated in their household furnishings constituted a touch of familiarity in surroundings that had initially appeared alien. Migration shifted the meanings, value, and emotional effect of everyday objects, and they transformed, if only temporarily, relationships between these objects and the migrants. In other words, seeing and handling home country objects helped to establish a degree of continuity with life prior to emigration or relocation, and had the potential of stirring up memories and indeed self-reflection. Now, the potency of material objects to rouse strong emotional reactions can be illustrated by an encounter recorded by Pastor Andreas Sandel. On a trip to New York with Pastor Eric Bjork in 1702, the men saw Swedish cannons in the town's fort. "We put our hands on the cannons," Sandel recalled. It was as if this physical engagement and symbolic gesture could in fact bring them closer to people and places they had left behind. The Swedes then, who were transplanted to the New World, even after, I should add, the conquest of their colony by the Dutch and later the English, always retained a strong affinity towards their mother country. And I apologise, I noticed if you're watching on the enhanced PowerPoint slide, I think I've jumped prematurely on the slide to other European colonists, and I apologise for that. But if you want to refer back, you can of course use the traditional PowerPoint that I've also uploaded to Blackboard. Okay, so other European colonists is the next theme to consider in this lecture. Now, the close proximity of the Swedes to Dutch and English immigrants, especially after the fall of the colony, had equally transformative consequences for the everyday life of the Swedish migrants and settlers. This coexistence led to intermarriages, religious conversions, and alterations in patterns of consumption, as just several examples. The regular flow of European goods that was established in the second half of the 17th century, coupled with economic stability and increased immigration from Europe, made the material world tastes and worldviews of the Finnish and Swedish families increasingly similar to those of their Dutch and English neighbours. New Sweden embraced these changes, while the inhabitants, as mentioned, retained their affinity to the old country. At the same time, and as historians Terry Jordan and Matti Kaups agree, Finnish ways of life well adapted to a forested landscape, and they significantly contributed to the formation of frontiersman's culture, which developed at the fringes of all colonial settlements. And again, this is something I was alluding to earlier in the lecture. We can see this, for example, through the explosion of log cabin construction along frontier regions, not just in New Sweden, but also along British North America's backcountry regions, Pennsylvania especially, and those of the future United States. The Swedes and Finns, in other words, had an influence well beyond the confines of their own colony. For example, when the Finns and the Swedes began to arrive in New Sweden, along both the banks of the Delaware River into modern-day Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania and Maryland, they also brought their knowledge of such wood construction, as I've just described in the log cabin, with them. So, in truth, did later migrants from Germany. The Scots, the Irish, and the Scotch-Irish, the latter especially, who would go on to form a large portion of British North America's backcountry regions, had no tradition of building with logs, but they quickly adopted and adapted the technique learned from their Swede-Finn neighbours. As Clinton Weslager, whose book on log cabins is still considered a key work in this particular area, the log cabin was especially suited to early settlers and later pioneers. And the question is why? And before I tell you the answer, perhaps reflect for a moment or two on why the log cabin was especially suited to early settlers and later pioneers. And if you want to pause the PowerPoint and jot down an answer to this question at this stage, please feel free to do so. If you haven't, I'll continue with the answer myself. The answer is because it would have been nearly impossible to carry building materials across the ocean in the small sailing ships of the time. It would have been equally difficult to transport building materials on horseback, or even in the wagons or river barges pioneers used to cross mountains and valleys in their quest and search for land once they reached America or the frontier regions of America. That's why, wherever there were forested areas, the Finnish log cabin became the preferred type of initial dwelling. Log cabins did not need nails or spikes to hold them together. Until the 19th century, remember, nails were made by hand by blacksmiths, which meant that they were quite expensive and, like lumber, were also quite heavy if we're talking about transportation. Log cabins, which were relatively easy to build, were the perfect home for those eking their existence out of remote and difficult to supply European, North American frontiers. Now, what I've been describing, to all intents and purposes, is a cultural exchange between Old World and New, but this went both ways, remember. Returning travellers brought not only stories about America, they also supplied Swedish collectors with material objects, examples of the New World, of the New World's nature, and indeed indigenous art, and you can see a few examples on the PowerPoint. Through these things, America and its exotic inhabitants, and indeed valuable resources, were displayed, consumed, and appropriated. Material culture from the New World was actively used in defining Europe as well as America. Foreign objects were used in the Baroque staging of European supremacy and were displayed at European courts. Scandinavian aristocrats and royals were just as eager consumers and devoted collectors of the New World as were Spanish, Papal, or Holy Roman Imperial courts. But, of course, the Swedes might have had more limited contacts and resources, certainly where compared to the Spanish. Collecting and disseminating objects created entanglements then between peoples and places that could be both imagined and real. Now, in this particular lecture, we've again focused on a pre-Pennsylvania aspect of the Commonwealth's history. For all of its notable contributions to the region's and indeed future US history, New Sweden, which has been the focus of this lecture, always, and I will state this, always remained a small settlement that was vulnerable to Dutch and English neighbours. You always have the sense that New Sweden clung tentatively to those footholds it had established in North America. Ultimately, too, as a Baltic naval power, the international power of the Swedish kingdom was rooted in land-based military power, and the colony of New Sweden was always, therefore, very difficult to support in times of war or emergency. I mean to support, of course, from Old World Sweden. Remember, too, that fundamentally the Dutch had never accepted the Swedish colony as legitimate, and the struggle between the forces of the Dutch West India Company and the officials and backers of New Sweden was always an ongoing one. The situation of the colony wasn't helped by the fact that between 1651 and 1653, New Sweden had experienced a decline. The Swedish government, for instance, had lost a lot of interest in its colony, which was evident in the fact that they did not send a single supply ship or any ship from 1648 to 1654. Part of this neglect was due to the fact that all of the colony's supply ships, which for the first 5 years of Prince's governorship came with some regularity, were commandeered by the Swedish government to help in its war against the Netherlands. In this instance, I especially refer to the Second Northern War of 1655 to 1660. So the Swedish Navy, which was also distracted by the exigencies of defending national interests at home, was in itself incapable of protecting a colony in far-flung America. The Dutch then were able to relatively easily capture the Swedish holdings in North America in 1655. And without support and facing an overwhelming force of 7 armed ships and over 300 soldiers, the colony's position in 1655 was fundamentally untenable. But as I've said, and as I've alluded to when raising this issue before in this lecture, the conquest of New Sweden wasn't the end of the story by any means for the Swedish and Finnish populations who lived there. As for the region more widely, in 1664, the Second Anglo-Dutch War saw the English capture of New Netherland, and that colony was ceded to England through the Treaty of Breda. Though the Dutch would again take New Netherland in 1673 during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, it was yet again returned to England in 1674, thereby ending the Dutch Empire in North America. Key to this specific module, what had been New Sweden was now part of England's growing dominion. 1681 would of course bring the founding of the colony, later after US independence, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. However, the Swedish impact on the New World, though perhaps not as extensive as that of, and indeed influential as that of the British, Spanish and Portuguese, was notable, and those Swedes and Finns who'd inhabited our specific region retained as a group their political, cultural and economic influences, especially within those regions that they had settled. Okay, as I said to you in the last lecture, the difference between these online lectures and conventional face-to-face lectures is that I go through the lecture, it's not so obvious where I'll stop to pose questions, but as you listen to these lectures, do, if you feel necessary, pause them, take notes, think about the content, reflect upon the content, and as I always say, if you do have any specific questions or points that you require clarification on, contact me, let me know, and I'd be more than happy to deal with the queries that you have. That marks the end of this third lecture, which is my second lecture, and thank you very much indeed for listening to it.